So the first step in doing research is conceptualization and operationalization. So it's conceiving of what really are the topics, the abstract constructs of what we're dealing with, and operationalizing them, which is making them tangible and something that we can measure. So as I showed you in the first lecture, the research process is this massive diagram, and right now we're just going to focus on conceptualization and operationalization. And so when we're thinking about the metaphor that I presented the first lecture of research being a toolbox, it's like this is the part where we're gathering our materials and figuring out, okay, what exactly do I need? That are my materials, what are their names? And how can I say them in a way that other people understand what I'm saying and get them to be, if I'm measuring things, if it's more quantitative, get them to be measured in a way that makes sense as well. So measurement can be difficult and imprecise, and so we need to describe it explicitly. And we want to move, like I said, from vague abstract ideas into things that can be recognized and measured in the real world. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to communicate what the relevance of our study is. So these are the measurement steps. There's conceptualization, then conceptual definition, operational definition, and then measurement in the real world. And so as you see, these things get more specific and more specific as we move down this measurement step list. So a conception is a mental image we have about something. So if you think of one of the biggest criminal justice theories, social disorganization, when we think of disorganization, we all have a different mental image of what that might look like in our head. And concepts are word, phrases, or symbols in language that are used to represent these mental images. So I may imagine broken windows, or I may imagine lots of people in an area, or maybe disorder to me is not having that many people in an area. So there is some variability when we think about these larger abstract concepts of what they look like. And so conceptualization is specifying precisely what we mean. And we then come up with a bunch of indicators of what we have in mind. So we might come up with a checklist of things that are disorderly. And their presence or absence allows us to log what the degree of disorganization. So there are three classes of measurement. The first is direct observable, so things we can directly observe. So things you can see that are tangible. Then there's indirect observable, so things that are more subtle, like criminal history records, court transcripts, reports. So things that I couldn't just tell by looking at a person, but if I did some digging, I could find them out. And then constructs are more theoretical creations that can't be observed. So for example, disorganization is something that can't be directly observed, but I can have a list of direct observables that indicate whether or not there is disorganization. So levels of measurement. There's nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So nominal is things that don't have any particular organization in how they're categorized. So gender, state of residence, race, there's not any type of hierarchy that exists in those spaces. Whereas ordinal is things that do have sort of an organized way in which they are. So education, there are different levels of education. Opinions, you might put opinions on a Likert scale. So a Likert scale is something you see in surveys you take where it's like, how likely are you to do this? Very likely, less likely, extremely likely. And so there's a range of possibilities that can occur, but there is an order to them. Interval is like very particular measurements of not occurrences, but like waist size. There's very much, the distance between a 24 waist to a 27 waist. There's a particular distance that occurs within those things that's consistent each time. And so, especially in the sciences, you'll deal a lot with like intervals, but ratios is a lot of where criminal justice research occurs. So there's usually a true 0 point. And so age, sentence length, income, number of priors, there's usually a true 0 point. And often we deal with ratios too because we're counting instances or proportions within a given area. So if we're talking about crime, it's usually crime rate, right? We're not saying that there's 12 instances of this crime. It's instead a percentage of crimes within a given year. So time is often a part of ratio measures. So these are examples of these types of measurements. Nominal is like gender, female, male. There's no particular relation or hierarchy or organization. This is an example of a Likert scale. How important is religion to you? Not very important, fairly important, very important, most important thing in my life. And so with ordinal measures in particular, we don't necessarily know if the distance between very important and most important thing in my life is the same as fairly important and not very important. There's some variability there that we need to account for. And so it's not like a hard quantitative number, it's more a generalized space. So it's not super valid, right? Remember, validity is how accurate things are to their measurement. And so interval measures is like IQ. We do know the exact distance between these numbers means something. And so if you were to have an IQ that was 5 points higher than mine and someone else's, it would be the same, right? And the quality of it is the same. And then ratio measures, in this particular example of income, we are dealing with a ratio of per year, right? So it's $40,000 per year. So ratios, a lot, think of like if you're trying to identify a ratio, think of, is this per something? Then it's a ratio. So measurement we can think of as scoring. It's assigning numbers and labels and categories in order to represent the concept's properties. So it's like when we're conceptualizing something, we're coming up with a concept, then we're defining it as a variable, and then measuring it is, all right, let's create particular attributes for this measurement. And so this can be difficult in criminal justice research because the concepts are not perfectly definable. So we're often dealing with crime or harm. So it's like, how do we measure harm? Harm is like a pretty abstract notion. And so it can be difficult to measure. Units of analysis are what or who is studied. And so generally when you're presenting your findings, your units of analysis are composed in that. So if you hear a statistic of like, let's say people who are released post bail are 10% less likely to commit a crime, then your finding is connected to your unit of analysis. And what did we say? We said people. So it's an individual that we're talking about. So individuals include police, victims, defendants, inmates, gang members, burglars, or maybe you're not into criminal justice and you're thinking of children or teachers or lawmakers, but we're talking about individual units. Groups are multiple people with the same characteristics, and this includes counties, states, geographical locations as well. And so oftentimes in criminal justice, we are dealing with crime rates, which are attached to particular areas, groups. Organizations are also something we study. So prisons, police departments, courtrooms, drug treatment centers. So it's any formal group with an established leader, like your clubs in your college, classrooms in college, those would be types of organizations. And then social artifacts, which is more qualitative analysis. Most of the time, there are more quantitative analysis of like social media posting and opinion in that way that can occur. But it would be under social artifacts as well. So any stories in newspaper clippings, photographs in crime scene, incident reports. So anything that where you're using like primary sources is a social artifact. And so operationalization is defining these variables that we're interested, and it moves us closer to measurement. And it requires us to determine what type of work we have to do for data collection. And every variable, when we're moving from conception all the way to defining our variables and trying to measure them, should be exhaustive, and that you should be able to classify every observation in terms of one of the attributes composed of the variable. So, for example, if you are dealing with, let's say, gender, and you just do male and female, but maybe you have people who consider themselves non-binary or who are not really wanting to categorize themselves in that way, then you would need to sort of adjust and be exhaustive. And mutually exclusive means that you can't have multiple attributes for one variable. So unless you're dealing with like a composite score or something like that, then you would want to very much have it so that way. An example of this would be if you are flipping a coin cannot flip both heads and tails at the same time. So generally you want to make sure that your variables cannot be multiple of the same thing, or else you're measuring multiple things and it gets murky and is not as reliable and valid. And so we're going to talk about measurement quality at the next lecture.